When it comes to Yu-Gi-Oh, there are so many different decks a player can choose from. And luckily, because there are so many different kinds of decks, a player can find one that fits their style. That's one of the beauties about this game. However, when you ask a player whether your deck is good enough, you might get a different answer depending on who you ask. If you were to ask a casual player, they might say, your deck can win as long as you believe in the heart of the cards. But if you were to ask that to a competitive player, they may say something like, your deck sucks. If you need to win, you need to play these decks. Not very encouraging, now is it, that last one? And honestly, that's something a lot of players do not like about this game. However, I would argue that both the former and latter statements are correct, but at the same time, incorrect. From my perspective, any deck is capable of beating any deck. Of course, though, there are some important elements you need to take into consideration. And let me be clear here, this is not advice. This is simply my opinion and view on the subject, so feel free to use this information however you like. Number 1. Building a good deck for the right environment. Now, when I'm saying any deck can beat any deck, I'm not saying your Yu-Gi-Oh! Kaiba starter deck from 2002 can suddenly beat the best deck in today's game. No, no. What I'm saying is, your deck can beat any deck if you build it right. When it comes to looking at a casual player's deck, I will agree most of the time with the competitive players that they are not really the best. They are bad. If you could be playing your deck at YCS or locals, then you need to build a deck that has a clear goal, a consistent way of getting to that goal, and uses cards that complement each other. Meaning, you can't just take a Blue Eyes deck and a Dark Magician deck, mix them together, and expect it to work somehow. No, they have no synergy together. You need to have an idea of what you want your deck to do. Obviously, you want to try and win, but how exactly do you want to win? That's the question. Do you want to summon a bunch of big beaters and just run over your opponent, or summon one big bad boss monster that's near impossible to get rid of? Or do you want to play the slow and grind game and just stun on your opponent? Let's say for one example, you want to focus on summoning out Blue Eyes Chaos Max Dragon and use its double piercing battle damage effect to win the duel. There's your goal. Once you have a clear understanding of what you want your goal to be, then you want to start using these cards that can help you achieve that goal. And be honest with yourself when you know a card is bad. No matter what you do and no matter what you say, it's never gonna make the card any good. You best take that bad card and just either put it in storage, make jewelry out of it, or just frame it. That's pretty much the best you can do with it at this moment. However, just building a good deck is only the start. The next thing you need to do is build it for the right environment. Now let's be clear here, there's no such thing as a perfect deck. Try as we might, no matter what, we can't always build the perfect deck for every single scenario. That's like trying to prepare for a fight that may not happen. Instead, all we can do is adapt to the environment we're in and make any changes that are necessary. Kind of like how the seasons change. Like when it's summer outside, you do not want to be wearing your winter jacket. You're going to be sweating buckets. Nor do you want to be wearing your summer gear during the winter time. You're just going to be freezing yourself. And to those of you that actually do that, you got guts. You got boldy guts. Now, what do I mean when I'm referring to the environment? I'm referring to where you're going to be playing Yu-Gi-Oh! Say if you're going to your local card store, for example, some of the players there may play some of the best decks that currently exist. Other players, though, that might be playing either low-tier decks or decks they just really like in general. If you're focusing on just the environment and you can build your deck to anticipate and prepare for decks that you know you're going to be facing, then you have yourself a really good deck. We've seen this happen before. One example is YCS Niagara from 2022. In the event, the best deck at that time was Tearlaments, a deck that could easily recycle back its monsters and get a fusion monster out of it. And this deck was clearly outperforming every other deck that currently existed at that moment. However, the player that won the event, Raymond Dai, won the event with an Exo-Sister deck, a deck that was considered very low tier. Exo-Sister had a gimmick where if your opponent moved any card out of a main graveyard, well then they get to have a little fun. But a lot of players did not look at Exo-Sister's way because, well, of the fact that you had to rely on your opponent to do something. And that was considered not very good because, well, why the hell would your opponent want to do something that benefited you? Seriously, they're trying to win, so why the hell would they help you? But it was the perfect deck for this environment because the best deck had to move cards out of their graveyard. That was their gimmick. They couldn't just not do it. It also helped that not many players understood how the Exosucer deck worked at the time. If you want to read more about this event, then check out the article from TCG Player Infinite that's linked in the description below. Now, after this event, did Exosucer become the new best deck of the format? No, not by a long shot. Tyranimus was still the best deck. But you can see that even a low tier deck is capable of being a higher tier deck if you build it for the right environment. Overall, you just need to pick the right deck for the present moment, build it right, and make sure you build it for the right environment. Had Raymond Dye brought this kind of deck to a local tournament, there's no guarantee he would have easily won that tournament. Because he built it with the goal of beating tier limits specifically, which was perfect for YCS Niagara. Not for a tournament where players could be playing who knows what. Number 2. Players' knowledge and skill. One thing that players tend to forget sometimes is the player that's piloting the deck they are facing. We have to remember it's not just the deck we're facing, but the player behind the deck as well. The reason this is important is because the player playing the deck is human, which means there's a possibility they can make a mistake. And that's just an undeniable fact. We humans are going to make mistakes from time to time. It's inevitable. Try as we might, we can't always avoid making mistakes. And sometimes these mistakes can cost us games. And that's the part we can use to our advantage. When players are getting ready to deal with other decks, they usually focus on preparing for the decks they're considered to be the best, which means they aren't focusing on a low tier deck like ours. And this gives us the element of surprise because they aren't always going to know what our cards do or what cards we will be playing in our deck. Sure, they can make some accurate guesses on what cards we might be playing, but that's all they will be, just guesses. Best part of all, they aren't always going to know how to deal with our deck. Here's a personal example. I once played against a player that was playing one of the new best decks in the current format. And when comparing my deck to his, I can easily tell he had the better deck. And I can even tell he practiced playing a lot with it. Once the dust settled on our duel though, I came out as the victor. And after the duel, we talked a little bit and I talked about how I managed to one-up him with some of my tricks. But then he told me it was mostly because he didn't understand what most of my cards did or what plays I would be making. He had practiced to deal with some of the other best decks, not my deck. Me though, I had anticipated playing against his deck and prepared for it, so I knew what to do, as well as know which of my cards worked best against his. Now granted, if we keep facing the same deck over and over again, they will come to learn and understand our deck, make some adjustments, and know how to deal with it. But in this first few moments, we will have the element of surprise. Another thing to consider is the player's skill level. Knowing where a player's skill level is at is very helpful in determining how we will play our game. If their skill level is low, then they aren't always going to make the most correct plays. But if their skill level is high though, we may have to anticipate the best plays that their deck can make. The point is, if a player's skill level is low and they're playing one of the top tier decks, then there's a good chance they won't always make the most optimal play, nor will they know what cards to side into. If their skill level is high though, we may have to use certain cards to keep them from getting the upper hand on us, like Floodgates. And say what you want, but if Floodgates give us a win, we take it. Number 3, look at the draw. As I'm sure you're aware, luck plays a factor in this game, most notably when we have to draw a card from our deck. That's why players work so hard on making sure their deck is consistent so that when they draw their opening hand, they will have the chance to make the play they want to make. However, if there's one thing that's guaranteed to happen, it's that we're going to draw into a bad hand at some point. No matter how hard we try, we can't always avoid drawing to a bad hand. But that also means our opponent will have to draw into a bad hand at some point as well. If they do and we open a good hand, this gives us a chance to win. Something players tend to neglect or even forget is that possibility of drawing to a bad hand. Sure, good players will make sure that the probability of drawing to their good cards is higher in their deck, but that doesn't always mean that the least favorable outcome won't happen. If the probability isn't 0, then there's always a chance for it to happen. And sometimes the least desirable hand a player can ask for can happen more than once, even shortly after the last one sometimes. I once played in the finals of a local tournament where my opponent opened 3 copies of a card he did not want to see multiple copies of. I quickly took that game, and then as we were getting ready for our next game, he made sure that those 3 cards were separated from each other. As soon as our next game started, he opened 3 copies of that exact same card again. Seriously, what are the odds of that happening after the last one? Like, now, I'm not saying this always happens. I haven't experienced a moment like that in years. But I have experienced moments where my opponent doesn't open with the most optimal hand and vice versa. Trying to look at this like flipping a coin. If we flip the coin 50 out of 100 times and all those 50 times were heads, does that mean all the rest is going to be tails? No. The chance is still going to be 50-50 no matter what. There's no guarantee that the rest of the coin flips are going to be heads. But that doesn't mean that it won't happen. Again, as long as the probability is not zero, there's always a chance for it to happen. I will say it's not always best to rely on that happening all the time, but still always be open to that possibility and take into consideration. While luck of the draw may not sound like the best way to win, it's still a win, so we take what we can get. Number 4, focus on the present, not the future. One thing I think people are too heavily focused on is the future. When they look at a deck and what it can do, they are focusing on how it perform against some of the best decks in the upcoming events. And that's understandable why. Players are always looking for the next best thing. However, we're not talking about tournaments. We're talking about how it's going to perform right now in the duel it's in. If you're just looking to play whatever deck you like, then don't focus so much on what might happen against certain decks. Do have plans for them, but don't always worry about what's going to happen. You're not looking to play against the same deck multiple times throughout the day. You're simply focusing on what's sitting across from you at the very moment. Focusing on the future does you no good since you have no control over it. All you control is how you play in the present moment. Stop focusing on the things you can't control and focus on the things you can control. From there, just enjoy the present moment. Overall, a deck is capable of beating any deck. You just have to make sure you know what your deck's goal is, have a consistent way of getting to that goal, and use cards that complement each other. Make sure you not only build your deck for how the game is played in the present moment, but also for the right environment you'll be using it in. Know what it is you will be facing and build accordingly for them. If you're playing a deck that's not well known, then your opponent may not know how to deal with it, which gives you the element of surprise. For the time being, and try to learn and determine a player's skill level. There's always a good chance that they will not fully understand certain things, nor will they know the right play to make, and we can use that to our advantage. One of my favorite things when playing against a lower skill level player is knowing and using the rules to my advantage. It really catches them off guard. And remember, luck does play a factor in this game. While we do our best to make sure we open with the right cards we want to see, it doesn't always mean we're going to have that kind of hand every single time. If we get a chance to open with a good hand and our opponent doesn't, or if their draw for turn was poor, then we try to take that opportunity that has presented itself. Lastly, just focus on the present moment and enjoy it. We can't control what's going to happen in the future, so why bother focusing on it? Focus on the here and now, and you will go on well. Again, all of this is not advice, but my opinion and view on the subject, so take whatever I say here with a grain of salt. Anyway, I'll see you guys in the next video, and I hope you had an awesome day.